Okay, hi, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring, and today I'm joined by award-winning journalist Robert Whitaker, probably most well known for Anatomy in an Epidemic, a great book that came out in 2010, but he's also written a lot of other great books, Psychiatry Under the Influence being another one, which we're going to be talking about. He's joining us today to cover a couple of topics. One is, what is wrong with the way psychiatry is practiced today in the US and maybe also globally? And then what I think is actually more interesting and something that I think about a lot is why there are so many problems and why they haven't been fixed. So I hope you enjoy this. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob, and just say welcome and ask you describe what the problems are with the way psychiatry is practiced in the US today.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
thanks first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. In a big picture way, I think you can state it quite simply. And that is ever since DSM-3 was published in 1980, excuse me, when DSM-3 was published in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association says it adopted a medical model. It's really was a disease model.
Hmm.
And one of the ideas was that these hypotheses actually was that these were discrete illnesses. And of course, one of the hypotheses was they were caused by chemical imbalances in the brain. And then pretty soon, we and prescribers began hearing about that we had drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, which is a narrative of great progress. And so we, we as a society, first the United States, but then this model was exported, organized ourselves around that narrative, which was a narrative of great progress. I mean, think about how complex the human brain is.
Hmm.
And so we were being told that researchers had identified the molecule that causes madness, the molecule that causes depression. And if that were true, I'd say that's one of the greatest discoveries of medical discoveries of all time, given the complexity of the human brain. But it wasn't true. In other words, it was a hypothesis. DSM-3 was basically created to say, we're going to hypothesize these are diseases of the brain, and then we'll find evidence for it to be so. But the hypothesis wasn't promoted to the public. And pretty soon, psychiatry itself convinced itself of this great progress it was making. If you look at the annual statements present by the presence of the APA starting, it's all, wow, but we're making these great understandings of how the human brain works. But that's the problem, ultimately, is that we organized our thinking around a narrative that told of great progress, of discovering the causes of diseases and effective treatments for those diseases. And if you look in the science, that wasn't the story in the science. The
Hmm.
chemical balance story was falling apart. As far as the drugs, they didn't fix any known pathology. The benefits were, exaggerated. The risks were minimized. And then, there was this confluence or this capture of American psychiatry and academic psychiatry for a period by the pharmaceutical companies. So we had both of those groups telling this story. We had the money for the pharmaceutical companies and their advertisements telling it, but we had the APA running educational campaigns as well, oftentimes in concert with the NIMH.
Well, let me ask you this. So there's these two events. One, we have the DSM, the DSM-3 comes along, and previously to this, when you have anxiety and depression, there used to be all this language, reaction, and it was more the way psychiatrists would describe this, officially in the earlier versions of the DSM is in ways where it could be more linked to contextual stresses and things happening in their life. But that gets thrown out the door, and then you just get, you know, major depressive disorder, 5 out of 9 symptoms for 2 weeks. It kind of just, kind of puts it neatly into this box of symptoms where you lose all of that, is it due to trauma or is it due to contextual stresses? It's just that. And so it becomes this, this disease model. And then there's this other part of it, this, like you say, the story of progress when, the antidepressants and the antipsychotics come onto the market and, there seems to be some therapeutic effect. So let's now say that anything that fits in this major depressive disorder box, is this illness and we have this pill for it. And I want to ask you, so I totally agree that those are the ideas. How do you see them? How did you see that trickling down into the clinics and the family practice settings and the places where people were receiving care? What do you think changed there at that level.
Well, I think this is really important. Also, going back to DSM-1 and DSM-2, what a huge shift it was. Because with those descriptions of reactions, you're talking about human beings that are responsive to their environment. Environment matters, right? And also that there are many different pathways to feeling depressed or anxious. And also, for example, that anxiety was quite normal, depression happens, that sort of thing. So there was a conception there of human beings being responsive to their environment, and that if you could change environments, these things could be episodic and all that. And that is so much more in sync with like what we know from in any sort of historical sense of conceptions, and also what you see in novels, plays, religious tracts, etc. We lose all that holistic, that complex, sophisticated sort of sense. And now all of a sudden we say, oh, it's just inside the brain of the individual. It's a molecular problem. Well, that's actually a reconception of who humans are and how they move throughout the world. And it's such an impoverished philosophical perception or conception of human beings. It's ahistorical and impoverished. Now, you asked, how does that filter down? The problem is that impoverished idea, conception, filtered into the clinics. And it also shut off communication. As you know, you're a doctor. One of the most important things of having a good outcome is an effective relationship with your doctor, a doctor who will listen to the patients. The doctor should be listening, but I can tell you how often I heard people say their psychiatrist would no longer listen. They just said, you have this problem, take the pill. If you're experiencing problems, it's the disease, not the pill. So it shut off this communication as well. And then the other problem that happened is when people got worse, which happens to some people, of course, it was never seen as the drug. It was always like, oh, that's your conditioning worsening. So what happened with this shift at the clinical level is so often the prescribers retreated into this very narrow mindset where they stopped listening. They thought the people weren't even good witnesses to their own lives. They attributed all the problems to the disease and not the drug. So you ended up at a clinical level with this sort of impoverished reaction between the two, and also the ignoring of the patient's experience and their life experience, their trauma, what was going on. Are they in poverty? Are they, are they grieving over something, or what's their life situation like? So at a clinical level, it led to just an interaction between prescribers and patients that was ultimately harmful. The interaction itself was harmful.
Yeah, and I think that's probably how a lot of people feel now when they see their psychiatrist. It's like, this person doesn't really care about me. They don't really care about what's going on in my life. It's more like, you're having some depression, any anxiety, any insomnia, and then okay, yep, yeah, it's been going. How long has this been going on for? Done. And that's kind of the level of understanding they're going for. And we could talk about, there's other things. There's things such as the rise of, I guess, managed care insurance, and the fact that there's pressures to see people in 15-minute visits now, where it's that model almost serves that kind of visit, because you end up having a production line kind of psychiatry where you just, okay, you've got this condition and now we've got a treatment for it. And so there's that part of it, which I think also is why this was so useful in kind of churning people through the clinics and making it easier for clinicians and I guess the people that are, invested in having higher flow through the clinic because of the money that it brings in. But then the other thing that's interesting with the DSM is that, they use things like it causes clinically significant distress. If you have 5 out of 9 symptoms that cause clinically significant distress, and it's like, what the heck is that? And so, you've got some people who could have, mild symptoms that might clear up in a couple of weeks. A young man going to a university, starting out afresh there, and it's stressful. Maybe he doesn't want to go to classes that one week. Is that clinically significant distress? There's no guidance in there for what it is. They leave it completely up to people to just kind of go for it. And then the other thing that's interesting about the DSM, and I guess most of the depression scales, is, when you have like a list of, 9 symptoms and you can pick 5 of them, I mean, they change. You can have 2 depressives that look completely different, and no one really cares about that either. And so, like you said, there's this impoverished, reduced view where it's just like, okay, but why does this person look different from that one? Who cares? It's not like, this is coming from some contextual stressor, or maybe you have an inflammatory disorder or something like that, and an autoimmune condition that's causing some depression. In all of these cases where you could kind of go after a root cause, it's this paradigm of like, we're only interested in the symptoms. We're not interested in the cause. That just, I guess, drives the kind of production line psychiatry that you see now.
Yeah, this is really interesting. You can tell me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding, there was a time before DSM-3, one of the first things that psychiatrists tried to do was, or even the medical community, is rule out physical causes for these things. Because we do know that, illnesses can cause depression, they can cause psychosis, it's inflammation of the brain, that sort of thing. But once we moved to just a symptom thing, the symptoms, of course, were mistaken for signs of an illness, okay? In other words, of a known illness somehow. And just going forward here is, after DSM-3, American psychiatry said, oh, we're going to be psychopharmacologists. We're going to leave the counseling to those other people. Basically what happened. That's why you got the 15-minute visits. By the way, I can't imagine going to medical school in order to just prescribe drugs to 4 people an hour. I mean, it seems, why would you want to do that? But that's what happened. And then what I think happened within psychiatry is they had allegiance to the story, to the narrative, because somehow it made them feel like, as we know, doctors treating real illnesses, and it did give them more prestige in society, and the newspapers would always be talking, they were sort of telling the story as well. And so what happened was, not only did they stop listening, but they stopped seeing their patients in the way you're talking about, physical problems, this sort of context. And all I can say is the feeling was that their allegiance was to their own story, their own narrative, and maintaining it for themselves, their own belief in that story. So sometimes we say, oh, managed care is the problem because they only pay for 15 minutes. Well, that sort of came in response to the psychiatrist saying, we don't need more than 15 minutes. We're just going to check the symptoms, and then if they're changing, we'll give them some other drugs or whatever, and you get into the polypharmacy. So, in my opinion, everything went awry in 1980 when American psychiatry decided to reconceive itself as basically a treater of illnesses of the brain, without any scientific discovery behind that reconception. And then you have all these problems you're talking about: lack of context, not listening, ahistorical. And the irony for me is, if you really wanted to be a medical doctor, if that's the way you wanted to present yourself, then the first thing you should be is really good at identifying physical illnesses that may be causing these secondary symptoms, right? And we know all this is true. We'll go back to end-stage syphilis. Parkinson's disease can cause psychotic symptoms. Inflammation of the brain can cause it. Toxins can cause it. There's all sorts of biological pathways to these different, poor diets, no exercise, etc. But all that gets lost with this impoverished, non-scientific. It really was a, as the American Psychological Association said when DSM-3 was published, this is more of a marketing document than a scientific document. Talking about DSM-3. And that has had, such profound consequences for our society, because as it was promoted to the public started seeing themselves this way. Oh, I'm not having a bad time because of this. I have depression, or I have bipolar illness, or I have ADHD. And it's not that the schools stink and they're boring and you're given to any of that stuff. This is inside me. So it changed how we think about ourselves, changed how we raised our kids, changed how parents think about their kids. So
yeah. And I mean, it's interesting that you say it's marketing, because from my experience in drug companies, the DSM and that whole conceptualization of mental illness is the greatest thing ever when it comes to marketing it, because I mean, drug companies, they don't just market the drug.